So skip the intro this time, trying to keep these a little bit shorter. The long and short of it is I'm only going to be showing you guys one game because it's actually just really difficult to find two games of tournament footage where one deck loses and one deck wins. It's proven to be too difficult and it really narrows the range of matchups that I can actually do. And I don't want to show you ladder footage because that's kind of whatever. The player skill difference could be there. And there's a bunch of factors. But I'm going to be trying to cover one game, go a little more in depth on the analysis, and tell you why what deck beats what. This time, Karma Ezreal is supposed to beat the Frostbite midrange, and there's a couple reasons for that. So in previous formats, Karma Ezreal, maybe it didn't beat this deck. The Reckless Trifarian version is obviously a little bit more aggressive and makes you think that it should actually pair better into a deck like this, the Karma Ezreal. But Karma Ezreal is now up to about 8 stun effects is the standard. That's 1 Yone, 3 Concussive Palm, 2 Steel Tempest, and 2 Will of Ionia is sort of the standard package for Karma Ezreal these days, which doesn't play out very well for the Frostbite midrange. Because you are only attacking every other turn, you only get about 5 attack turns before the Karma comes down, which is a card that is actually a little difficult for you to deal with. It has to be pretty much Harsh Winds or Flash Freeze into Culling Strike, because if you get to turn 10, and I have priority, and I can wait until I have priority to do this, the first action of the turn, rather. It doesn't even matter if I have first action, actually. So I play Karma. You play, let's say, Iceveil Archer, which is sort of the one problem with this. You play Iceveil Archer, my Karma goes to 0. Then I play Ezreal, then you Culling Strike or Reckoning or whatever, and now I have, theoretically 4 mana to do whatever with these two on board, which could represent as much as 8 damage if it's all 1 mana burst spells, even more if I throw out something like a Mystic Shot, Mystic Shot on its own is 8 damage with Karma Ezreal out, so you kind of get where I'm going here. It has to be like a Harsh Winds into a Culling Strike because Brittle Steel doesn't hit a leveled Karma, and typically you're not playing Flash Freeze. Stun effects just pair really well into this deck for how mana efficient the stun cards have sort of become, and you get punished a lot for not open attacking as the Frostbite player. And I think that's an adaptation players haven't really started to figure out yet, because Concussive Palm is such a big punish if you don't open attack, and because units are so important for softening up the board of the Frostbite midrange player, because you are not running things like damage-based removal. Agigas is running the Mystic Shot Gotcha Get Excited version, but Gotcha and Get Excited typically only going to be like 2 ofs on their own. It's not something that we see all the time or very often, really. I'd say maybe half the time we're seeing Gotcha Get Excited versions, but either way, it's really the stun effects that shine in a matchup like this. And Agigas does a very good job of controlling the board here. You really need to be cognizant of the Trifarian Assessor as sort of the one thing your opponent can do to get them back into the game. And I'll get into a second here about how you can go about controlling that, because I think Agigas does a pretty good job of it. Cephalopod, obviously, you'd rather push through 6 damage than get an additional draw off the Assessor. So Chump Bomb comes in big here. The Karma Ezreal decks aren't super unit heavy, but the units are very important. And here's where it really comes up. So ignoring the Mushroom out of Agigas, both players have about 5 cards. Now, if you assume that your opponent has a Trifarian Assessor, well, let me actually color over the Assessor. So assuming your opponent has a Trifarian Assessor, they really only have 4 cards. And if one of those is a 5 attack unit, then all of a sudden, your opponent, it's pretty telegraphed that they're going to be going for an Assessor, and we don't even see Cephalopod have it here. The odds of them actually having a 5 attack unit that they could get down in the same turn as this Assessor is really big. And this is sort of one of those scenarios where, your opponent's unknown 4-card hand is very scary. But as your opponent starts to play things out, for example, this Iceveil Archer, everything that they have available to them is suddenly infinitely less scary. Unless these last 2 cards are specifically a Trifarian Assessor and a 5-attack unit, then Agigas really isn't afraid of anything that Cephalopod's going to be doing. Can even throw out the Thermo Beam onto this Reckless Trifarian here, which sort of forces the Assessor out of Cephalopod, because the odds of throwing down a 3rd Reckless Trifarian, which is the only other 5-attack unit he could have here, maybe Ashe, but if you throw down Ashe, that's a little bit scary. And then your opponent is going to go for, they're telegraphing not going for an open attack because they are going to have to play the Assessor, otherwise I'm going to Static Shock these in combat if you go for an open attack, and your Assessor gets less value. And here we see Cephalopod really stumble on getting the Assessor value. That's something that the Frostbite midrange has as sort of an inherent flaw right now, is the Assessor is deceptively hard to get off, and you do really lean on it. So cantripping with them doesn't feel as good as it sort of used to. And obviously, Agigas has a Static Shock. He kind of really set himself up for that one. There's nothing you can do about that. You really have to try and dig for that Elixir of Iron or Fury of the North or whatever you're playing as you're out to try and get that Reckless Trifarian out of range so that you can go for this. And this is what I was talking about. You only get 5 attack turns to, between turn 1 and turn 10. Your first attack turn is basically forfeit because all you could have is like an Omen Hawk, maybe an Everosyn Sentry. Your third attack turn... Sorry, let me make this a little more clear. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attack turns to kill your opponent before Karma Ezreal comes online. Your first attack turn is nothing. That's maybe an Omen Hawk and an Everosyn Sentry if you're lucky. That puts your opponent at 17. Your second attack turn is either going to be turn 3 or turn 4, so you have down typically 1 Reckless Trifarian. Let's even say that you went first. So Omen Hawk attack into Reckless Trifarian attack. This is one of your bigger attack turns. Like, you need to push some damage on the third attack. You should have probably 2 5-attack units by now. Assuming that it is turn 5, you've got Reckless, you've got Glory Seeker, you've got Ashe, you've got Kato, you've got Hearthguard. There are a lot of options. Turn 4, you pretty much need to put your opponent, or your fourth attack turn rather, this would be turn 7. You really need to push damage onto your opponent. You need to get in them cheeks and deal what you can. Your opponent needs to be at about 5 life. So Cephalopod playing this one pretty well so far. And then turn 5, like, you need to kill them. Because if Karma Ezreal gets online, it doesn't matter if you're at 20 life. As I had mentioned earlier, it's too hard for you to actually kill that Karma. And Cephalopod kind of, didn't have a very good, I think it was third attack. His fourth attack did what you really want it to. Closing the game can be the hard part. It's not unreasonable for you to actually kill your opponent on that fourth attack, and that's really what you're aiming to do. But typically your hand isn't going to line up like that, especially given the amount of stun effects that I had previously mentioned in the Karma Ezreal. And that's why I think this used to be Frostbite midrange favored, just because you could play out the board. Karma Ezreal couldn't really keep up because they had so much removal. Pretty much every Karma Ezreal for a while was playing Get Excited. Captain Pharaon's a pretty good way to try to finish off your opponent. But now we are approaching the Karma turn. If a Karma comes down here, you don't actually have an answer for it. And your opponent going into this attack turn with this Ezreal out is very scary for you, especially with 3 mushrooms in hand. Because Ezreal represents 6 damage on his own, which means if he has a real Mystic Shot in his hand, you just die. So you need to kill him this turn. This is that 5th attack turn I was talking about. If you don't end the game here, you die to a Karma Ezreal. And that can be difficult to do. Cephalopod's in a really awkward situation here. He's got a lot of plays available to him. He can go for an open attack. There are a lot of things that the open attack loses to. Something like a stun effect onto the Kato, or onto the Captain Pharaon, followed by, like a static shock and a block, and all of a sudden I'm alive. You only have mana for 1 decimate this turn because you only had 9. If you had 2 decimates, sure, go for the open attack, go for 2 decimates after I've expended all of my mana, because it'll probably take me at least, at least it takes me 4 mana, so I could still have deny available. It gets a little bit awkward from there on out. Kato is one of the problems I was talking about earlier, where you're actually not that safe to open attack. Imagine if there was a Yone coming out here. Now, I don't know if there was a Yone in a Gigas' deck, and that's why he didn't go for it, but Yone is becoming more and more standard in these Karma Ezreal lists. Yone right here would absolutely obliterate you. Instead, it's going to be Concussive Palm, which, bad news bears, that's basically a Yone because it does stun a unit and provide another blocker. This one actually does damage as well with the Ezreal, so even better than Yone, theoretically. But yeah, it's really hard for this deck to maintain cards if you feel like you have to tempo out with the Assessors to try and stay aggressive. And I think that's correct. I think that it's just kind of a flaw of the matchup for the Frostbite midrange player. And with Frostbite midrange being the sort of most popular deck and widely considered to be one of the best decks in the format, this is why I wanted to highlight this matchup, because there's a lot of different Ezreal decks you can play, and I do want to try to take the time and go through how each of them play into Frostbite midrange, because that's a matchup you're going to run into no matter what format you're playing. This was a 2-deck format, which means the Ezreal deck's there. A lot of people are switching to Modified Standard, which means best of 5 for Top Cut, which means you're going to have to play against the Ezreal deck. And if you can understand how to navigate your Frostbite midrange into it, I think it's going to do a lot for your win percentage in tournaments. Not necessarily your top percentage, but your win percentage. And Karma Ezreal, yeah, as it stands right now, just has the advantage because of how tempo efficient its spells are. Here we're going to see, that Mystic Shot does so much work in this matchup, surprisingly, and the units come in really big. You're down to 4, you're 1 decimate away from lethal, but if this last card is a Karma or a Deep Meditation, then you probably win. And that's a problem with the Karma Ezreal deck, is that even when it looks like they're gassed out, it only takes like 1 or 2 cards for them to actually kill you. If this last card was like a Mystic Shot, then we just have a 20-0 right here. That's why this deck is considered to be so good. And this is how, you know, obviously I was talking not so much about the game going on in the background, but you could watch it. It is firing off at 1.5 times speed. But that is how Karma Ezreal beats Frostbite midrange. And as you can see, Cephalopod even drew a pretty decent hand. Not a phenomenal one, but a decent hand. And yeah, so, you know, you've probably played the matchup yourself. You have a general idea of how it works. This is how it worked out this time around from those duels of Runeterra finalists. So that's the only game I have for you guys today. As I mentioned, it's been impossible for me to actually find two sides of this matchup. I haven't actually found footage from a tournament of the Frostbite midrange beating the Karma Ezreal, and that's just kind of the narrow lens of the caster. We're picking one game out of 100. You know, it's bound that we're going to miss some things. So I'm going to focus on putting these out a little bit more often because I think doing one a week was way too few. I'm limiting myself on the amount of matchups I can push out for a format that is as wide open as this one. And speaking of, I want to focus on Frostbite midrange matchups specifically for the near future because I want you guys to understand how to beat that deck because it is the most popular deck in the format, where it has good matchups, where it has bad matchups, and maybe help you craft a lineup to beat it. But that about does it for me today. My name is Boulevard. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. Figure out what, when, and where I'm casting every weekend. This weekend's Duels of Runeterra. Very excited to be back for that one. And hopefully I can get out enough Frostbite videos in the meantime so that you guys can understand how to pick on that lineup this weekend. And until then, good luck on your tournaments.